Guys, good morning. Great to see you all. It's great to have you here for our children's session again on Sunday morning. We're going to look at a little story from Exodus 16. We're going to look at a little cartoon that helps explain that story to us and see what we can learn. And then we're going to have a think about that afterwards before singing a song. So here we go.
God's story, wilderness. So part of God's story is about how God took care of his family in the wilderness. And it begins like this. For many years, God's family was stuck as slaves in Egypt. So God chose a guy named Moses to lead them out of slavery and into an amazing home called Canaan, or the Promised Land, where they could be free. From the moment the Israelites left Egypt, God made it clear that he was with his family. He led them with a cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. He actually split the Red Sea in two parts so they could walk to safety. But the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land was hard. In fact, the Israelites didn't know where to find food and water, or when they would get to Canaan. So just 3 days after leaving Egypt, they started complaining. "What are we going to drink?" Now Moses knew that God hadn't freed them from Egypt and parted the Red Sea just to let them die of thirst in the desert. So he asked the Lord to help, and God helped. Then, about a month later, they complained again. "If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt," they moaned. "There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us to death." They actually wished they could be slaves again. Kids, have you ever complained about something instead of trusting God for help? Well, guess what? God had a plan his family never could have imagined. In the morning, dew covered the ground, and when it was gone, there were flakes of food that looked like frost. The Israelites called it manna, which means, "What is it?" Moses told them to eat it all and not to save any. But of course, some people saved a little, just to be safe. Remember, they were worried they wouldn't have what they needed. The next morning, the old manna was full of maggots, which are little bugs. Yuck! But the good news is, there was also new manna. See, God wanted them to trust him every single day. What's really crazy, though, is on the 6th day of every week, God did tell them to gather enough for 2 days. That way, they had 1 day to rest. It's called a Sabbath, and it's a day of rest. So when they woke up on the 7th day of the week, the manna they had saved was as fresh as it was when it first fell. We don't know how that happened, but it did. Well, the Israelites kept traveling, following the cloud and fire, eating new manna every day, and getting a Sabbath every week.
So we are learning in today's story all about God's people on a journey to the Promised Land. Okay, the people had been rescued from Egypt, and they had been set free from misery and from slavery, but they were now on their way to this Promised Land. But what would this journey be like? And what was this new relationship with God like, or this new stage in their relationship with God like? And so we will see what happens to them in the desert as they travel to the Promised Land. Now, I want you to race and find this item for me. Are we ready, everyone? Okay, so I'm going to unmute you all. So are we ready? Come back here, Finn. Are we ready? I want you to get your favorite food item from the kitchen. Go.
Favorite food?
Well done, Bella. Well done, Nathan. Caleb, well done. Okay, so Bella was first. Bella gets a point. Okay, well done. Good, guys. So we've got some fruits. We've got some pasta. We've got lots of chocolate here. We've got Easter eggs, and we've got Haribo. Well, so what does favorite food have to do with today's story? Well, God's people were in the desert. You can put your favorite food item down now. They were in the desert, and they didn't have any of their favorite food. In fact, they didn't have water. they didn't have any food. And so they were grumbling a lot, okay? Despite being saved from Egypt, which is an incredible thing. That's like us being saved by the gospel, isn't it? They had been saved, and yet they weren't grateful towards God. And they were in real trouble, weren't they? And so they wished even that they were back in Egypt. Can you imagine that? They wanted to be back in Egypt under slavery. That's incredible, isn't it? Okay, and so they were grumbling and grumbling and grumbling, and God could have said, right, stop your grumbling, get on with it. Just keep going, get on with it. But God doesn't say that. God provides for them. Okay, now I want you to run and get your next item, which is some bread. Go. Caleb and Bella, I think that was a tie. Good effort, guys. Okay, so we see in today's story, I'm going to read out verse 11 and 12. And the Lord said to Moses, I've heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So we see that God does provide for them, despite their grumbling and their complaining and them not trusting God, that God still provides for them amazing meat and bread. And it tasted really good. We see later in the story, it says, now the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Wow, that tastes good, doesn't it? Okay, so I want you now to run and get a recipe book from your kitchen. Go.
Recipe book. Recipe book. Recipe book. Recipe book. Recipe book.
Another kitchen item. Nick!
Oh, Bella, wow. You are quick, Bella. And Sophie, well done.
I come first in everyone, Mum.
Okay, good work, guys. Now, what have these recipe books got to do with today's story? Well, we see that God provided some amazing food for the people, but there were certain instructions they had to follow. I want you to run and get a calendar or diary. Go.
Diary. Calendar.
Bella again. Wow, have you got these ready? Bella, how did you know what I was going to ask for?
I don't know. I just had a diary downstairs.
You've got a very organised house, Bella.
Yeah, I do.
Well done, guys. Who can tell me, how long were the people in the desert for?
40 days.
Not
40
days.
years.
They were there for
Was
40
it 40
years. Okay, guys? They were there for 40 years. Now, that is a long time. Okay? We've been in lockdown for 3 weeks, and I feel like I could probably do with a change. You know, it's been 3 weeks. It's been quite a long time. But this was 40 years. Imagine that, 40 years traveling through the desert on the same food each day. But the question is, why all of this? Why was God doing this? Well, we see at the beginning of the story, it was so that he may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. So they were only meant to collect for one day because they were meant to be dependent on God. God wants to know whether they would trust him each day. Okay, in times of need, we go to supermarket and we pile in enough pasta, hand gel and toilet paper to last 40 years, don't we? But God wanted them to be dependent on him for all things. So that's why they're only meant to collect for one day. But they're also meant to follow his instructions, okay? And so they were meant to be obedient. God was testing their obedience. And how do you think they did? Did they do well?
No.
Do you remember the maggots? Why were the maggots there?
Because they hadn't trusted God.
No, they didn't trust that God would provide food the next day, and so they saved some just in case, and of course it went off. Okay? And so we see that they were also greedy, and they went out on the seventh day as well in the story we saw. But despite the grumbling against God, God still provided. Despite the disobeying God, God still provided. And this is God's grace in full flow, isn't it? Unmerited yet lavishly generous. But is this all just about food? What do you think? Is this just about food? What does this point to? Who can tell me? What does Jesus say he is in the New Testament? He says, I am the...
Messiah.
Go on, Bella.
God, Son of God.
He says, he doesn't say on the Son
The
of God,
Messiah.
for instance. He says, I am the bread of life. In other words, Jesus was helping us see that, yes, food's really important and we need food to survive, okay? But ultimately, our greatest need is Jesus, because Jesus gives us eternal life, and he's the one that satisfies us more than anything else in the world. Okay, so as we think about this story, in your household, if it's anything like our household, over the last 3 weeks, there might have been, on occasions, a little bit of grumbling. Has there been any grumbling in your house? There's been a little bit of grumbling. There's a few acknowledgements there, yeah. So next time someone grumbles in your house, that's whether it's your brother, sister, mum, dad, dog, cat. Anytime they grumble, okay, you can say, well, would you rather be back in Egypt? Okay, because that's what the people want to be back in Egypt, which is silly because that's back in slavery, isn't it? Whereas we'd rather be under God's blessing, trusting him and following him each day for his provision. Thumbs up to that? Nice, okay. Good, guys. So we're going to sing a song now. Here's our song, God Sits in the Highest Place. Let's sing together with loads of actions.
It don't matter what the proud ones say, God sits in the highest place. Even when the wicked ones disobey, God sits in the highest place. You know, God sits in the highest place, full of glory, full of grace. It don't matter what the proud ones say, 'cause God sits in the highest place. When the liars lie and the haters hate, God sits in the highest place. When the waters rage and the mountains shake, God sits in the highest place. You know, God sits in the highest place, full of glory, full of grace. It don't matter what the proud ones say, 'cause God sits in the highest place. He's gonna banish sin and shame. God sits in the highest place. The nations tremble at his name. God sits in the highest place. You know, God sits in the highest place, full of glory, full of grace. It don't matter what the proud ones say, 'cause God sits in the highest place. It don't matter what the proud ones say, 'cause God sits in the highest place.
Guys, thanks for that great singing. And I'm now going to pass on to Von, who's going to lead us in prayers. And then Karen's going to come and read to us before Drew shares the word with us today.
I've been changed.